Have you ever wondered what happens when you trade the rush of city life for the quiet heartbeat of a small town? When the sound of traffic fades and the only thing you hear is the whisper of wind through old oak trees? Robert Turner did, and that question changed his life. After 40 years of working in the crowded streets of Chicago, he packed his bags and drove to a little town he'd never even heard of before, Maple Creek. He thought he was escaping noise, but what he found was something he never expected: clarity, connection, and a kind of happiness the city never taught him to feel. Robert Turner's first morning in Maple Creek didn't go as planned. He woke up expecting silence, the kind that presses against your ears and reminds you how alone you are. But instead he heard something else: birds. Not the faint chirping you hear through glass skyscraper windows, but real, near, alive, like the whole world was speaking to him for the first time. He stepped outside with his coffee, the steam curling into the crisp morning air, and watched the sun rise over endless green fields. For a moment he just stood there, realizing something strange. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't rushing anywhere. He wasn't late. That was when the first lesson of small-town life revealed itself: the gift of time. In the city, every second had felt like a competition. Here, every moment felt like a chance. Time moved slower, softer, almost kindly. The neighbors across the street, an elderly couple named Martha and Bill, waved at him like they'd known him for years. A paperboy dropped off the local Gazette, smiling wide enough to make Robert smile back. And for the first time in decades, Robert didn't measure his morning by tasks completed, but by how deeply he breathed. It was unsettling, almost suspicious, this feeling of peace. Could life really be this simple? Could slowing down actually bring him closer to something he'd lost along the way? He didn't have an answer yet, but as he sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through his hands, Robert knew one thing for certain: something inside him had begun to wake up again. Later that week, Robert wandered into Millie's diner, the kind of place that looked frozen in time, with checkered floors, creaky bar stools, and the smell of pancakes and maple syrup floating through the air. As he took a seat by the window, he noticed something unusual. People here didn't stare at screens. They looked at each other. Conversations flowed like familiar songs, and laughter filled the air like music. Within minutes, the waitress, a woman in her 50s named Millie herself, poured him a fresh cup of coffee and said, with a wink, "First time in town, huh? Don't worry, we'll make you one of us soon enough." It caught him off guard: the warmth, the ease, the genuine kindness. In the city, years had passed without anyone knowing his name. But here, strangers remembered what he ordered after meeting him once. That was when the second benefit of small-town life revealed itself: real human connection. He began visiting Millie's every morning, and each time someone new pulled up a chair. There was Sam, the retired firefighter with endless stories, Jenny, who ran the town's little library, and old Mr. Carson, who brought a puzzle book wherever he went. They talked about everything: weather, baseball, the past, dreams they still chased, even in their 70s. One evening, as the diner lights dimmed and everyone said their goodbyes, Robert paused at the door. A strange feeling filled his chest, something between gratitude and disbelief. It had taken him 68 years to realize that connection wasn't about how many people surrounded you, it was about how deeply a few cared. And as he walked back home under the amber glow of the streetlights, he couldn't help but smile. Maybe this little town had a secret he was just beginning to understand. A few nights later, Robert couldn't sleep. The city had trained him to need noise: the hum of cars, the faint sirens, the flicker of distant lights through curtains. But now, there was none of that. Just silence. Deep, almost unnerving silence. He lay awake, listening to the stillness pressing against his thoughts. It was strange how silence could feel so heavy, yet so alive. For years he drowned his worries and distractions, but now in this quiet place, his mind began to speak again. He got out of bed, wrapped himself in a blanket, and stepped onto the porch. The moon hung low over Maple Creek, bathing the fields in silver light. Somewhere far away, a lone owl called out. Robert closed his eyes, and suddenly, memories began to surface. His late wife's laughter, his daughter's first steps, the smell of rain from a summer long gone. It hit him like a tide, all the moments he'd buried beneath the rush of city living. That's when he realized the third benefit of retiring to a small town, the healing power of silence. In that quiet, he could finally hear the parts of himself he'd ignored for years. There was no noise demanding his attention, no calendar shouting at him to move faster, just space. Wide, forgiving space where grief could soften and peace could settle. The next morning, he woke up with a calmness he hadn't felt in decades. He sat by the window, watching the sunrise spread across the hills, and whispered to himself, maybe silence isn't emptiness. Maybe it's where healing begins. And deep down, Robert knew Maple Creek wasn't just a place. It was a second chance to listen to life again. One morning, as the sun spilled golden light across Maple Creek, Robert found himself standing in front of a small farmer's market near the town square. Wooden stalls lined the streets, filled with fresh apples, handmade candles, and jars of honey that sparkled like liquid gold. There were no billboards, no flashing lights, no rush of people pushing past each other, just a quiet rhythm that felt almost sacred. Robert wandered between the stalls, touching the rough wood, smelling the ripe fruit, feeling the air unhurried around him. A little girl offered him a small paper bag of cookies her grandmother had baked. "Try one," she said proudly. He did, and it tasted of butter, sugar, and kindness. He smiled, realizing how different this was from his old grocery runs in Chicago, where checkout lines stretched endlessly, and no one looked up at their phones. That afternoon, sitting on a bench under a maple tree, Robert understood the fourth benefit of small-town retirement, the beauty of simplicity. Here, life wasn't about more, it was about enough. Enough food to share, enough time to breathe, enough joy to fill the day. He didn't need luxury restaurants or high-end stores. A walk to the market, away from a neighbor, a quiet lunch by the lake, they gave him something money never could, contentment. Yet simplicity wasn't just peaceful, it was powerful. It stripped away the noise, the expectations, the constant race. It reminded him that happiness isn't found in what you own, it's found in what you appreciate. As Robert headed home, the cool wind brushing his face, he thought to himself, maybe the world isn't getting faster. Maybe we just forgot how to slow down. And for the first time in years, slowing down didn't feel like losing. It felt like finally winning.
A few weeks later, Robert received a handwritten note in his mailbox, something that hadn't happened in years. The envelope was simple, the handwriting neat and a little shaky. Community picnic, Saturday at the town park. Bring yourself and maybe a story or two. He smiled. In Chicago, no one had ever invited him to anything without a formal RSVP or a digital calendar link. But here, a simple note was enough to make him feel seen. When Saturday came, the park buzzed with laughter and music. Long tables overflowed with homemade pies, barbecue ribs, and potato salad. Children chased each other through the grass, their laughter echoing into the hills. As Robert arrived, Millie waved him over and handed him a plate before he could even say hello. "You're family now," she said with a grin. At first, he felt shy, unsure where to sit, unsure if he truly belonged. But that doubt faded fast. Sam, the retired firefighter, pulled him into a conversation about fishing. Jenny insisted he try her peach cobbler, and before long, Robert was laughing harder than he had in years. The way people listened here, really listened, made him realize something profound. That day, he discovered the fifth benefit of retiring to a small town, the joy of belonging. It wasn't about fitting in. It was about being accepted exactly as you were. No titles, no status, no competition, just community. People here didn't care what kind of car you drove or how big your house was. They cared if you showed up, if you smiled, if you shared a story that made someone's day a little bit better. As twilight painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Robert sat quietly under the oak trees, watching everyone pack up with slow, happy ease. It hit him then. He hadn't felt this kind of warmth, this sense of home, in decades. He whispered to himself, "I came here looking for peace, but maybe what I really found was family." A month into his new life in Maple Creek, Robert began to notice something unexpected. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of meaning, of moments of people who genuinely cared. But one morning, as he passed by the old library, he saw a handwritten sign taped to the door. Volunteers needed. Help us organize community reading sessions. He paused for a long moment, reading those words over and over. In the city, he'd spent years leading meetings, managing deadlines, always busy but rarely fulfilled. Now, here was an opportunity that didn't pay in money, but maybe, just maybe, in something far more valuable. He walked inside. The air smelled of old paper and pine wood. Jenny, the librarian he'd met at Millie's diner, looked up in surprise. "Robert, you read, don't you? We could use your help." Her tone wasn't a question. It was trust, freely given. And so, without hesitation, he agreed. Days turned into weeks, and the library soon became his second home. He read to children every Thursday, shared old stories with retirees every Sunday, and helped restore shelves that hadn't been touched in years. He even started a small book club for veterans and retirees, a place where laughter and life lessons blended into something beautiful. That's when Robert uncovered the fifth benefit of retiring to a small town, the gift of purpose. Here, no one was too old to matter. Everyone had something to give, a story, a skill, a helping hand. Purpose wasn't about earning, it was about meaning. And in helping others, Robert realized he was really helping himself. One evening, after closing the library, he stood by the window and watched the sunset spill orange light across the town. He smiled softly, whispering, "Maybe purpose isn't something we chase all our lives. Maybe it's something that finds us, once we slow down enough to see it." That night, as he walked home beneath the warm glow of the street lamps, Robert felt something new stirring in his heart. Not just peace, but pride.
Winter arrived early in Maple Creek that year. The kind of winter that painted rooftops white and made every breath visible in the air. One cold morning, Robert woke to the sound of wind howling outside and snow piling against his porch. He wrapped himself in his old wool coat and went to shovel the path, but the cold bit deep and his back ached with every push. Halfway through, he stopped to catch his breath, feeling the sting of loneliness creep in. That's when he heard a voice behind him. "Need a hand, Mr. Turner?" It was Sam, the retired firefighter, bundled in layers with a shovel slung over his shoulder. Before Robert could even answer, two more neighbors, Martha and her husband Bill, appeared with thermoses of hot cocoa. "You do one side, we'll do the other," Sam said. Within minutes, laughter echoed through the street as they worked together, joking, sharing stories, and warming the icy air with friendship. When the last patch of snow was cleared, Martha handed Robert a steaming cup. "In Maple Creek," she said softly, "no one faces the storm alone." That moment stayed with him long after the snow melted. It revealed the seventh benefit of small-town retirement, the strength of community support. In the city, neighbors were often strangers, but here people showed up, not out of obligation, but out of care. Whether it was fixing a broken fence, dropping off soup when someone was sick, or shoveling snow on a freezing morning, this town moved like one beating heart. Robert realized that in Maple Creek, help wasn't requested, it was offered. That night, as he sat by the fire with the cocoa Martha had given him, Robert stared into the flames and thought about how different this life was from what he'd imagined. In his old apartment, he'd been surrounded by millions, yet felt invisible. Here, in a town of a few hundred, he'd never felt more seen. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Maybe real security isn't in money. It's in people who care enough to knock on your door." Spring returned to Maple Creek with a kind of quiet magic, the kind that made you stop and notice the smallest things. The ice melted into clear puddles, wildflowers began to bloom along the fences, and the hills beyond Robert's home turned the color of hope. One morning, he decided to take a walk beyond the edge of town, where a dirt trail led toward Maple Creek Lake. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, and every step seemed to carry a sense of renewal. When he reached the lake, the water was so still it mirrored the sky perfectly, a sheet of blue so calm it looked unreal. Robert sat on a wooden bench nearby, closed his eyes, and listened to the gentle lap of water against the shore. It was there, in that quiet space between breath and breeze, that something inside him began to unwind. All the tension, the years of deadlines, the noise of the city, it started to fade, replaced with something softer, simpler: peace. That day, Robert discovered the eighth benefit of retiring to a small town: the strength of community support. In Maple Creek, nature wasn't just scenery, it was therapy. It spoke without words, through rustling leaves, through birdsong at dawn, through sunsets that reminded you that endings could be beautiful too. Each day, Robert found new reasons to step outside, to walk by the stream, to plant flowers in his garden, to feel the earth beneath his feet. One afternoon, as he watched children skipping stones across the lake, he realized something profound. Peace wasn't something you had to earn. It was something nature freely gave, if you just took the time to listen. When he returned home that evening, Robert felt lighter, as if the world had pressed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You're right where you belong." He sat by his window, watching fireflies dance in the dark, and smiled quietly to himself. The city had given him success, but Maple Creek had given him life.
One late summer evening, Robert sat on his porch watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the hills. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. He leaned back in his rocking chair and realized, for the first time in decades, he had nothing to rush for. No deadlines, no alarms, no meetings, no city pressure telling him to be somewhere he didn't want to be. But just as that thought began to soothe him, he felt something else: confusion. For so many years, pressure had been his fuel. It had kept him moving, kept him relevant. Without it, what was left? The question tugged at him like a whisper he couldn't ignore. The silence of Maple Creek was starting to teach him things about himself that he had avoided facing for too long. The next morning, he walked into town and met Sam at the diner. Between sips of coffee, he admitted softly, "I don't know who I am without the rush." Sam smiled, leaning back in his chair. "That's the best part," he said. "Out here, no one expects you to be anything. You just are." That simple truth struck Robert deeper than he expected, and it was then he discovered the ninth benefit of retiring to a small town: freedom from pressure. Here, life didn't demand performance. No one cared about titles, deadlines, or bank balances. There was no invisible race to win, only time to live. The neighbors didn't ask what he did, they asked how he felt. He could spend the whole day painting the old fence, sitting by the lake, or reading a book, and it still felt meaningful. That evening, as the stars began to appear one by one, Robert looked up at the vast night sky, clear, endless, unpolluted, and felt a strange kind of peace settle in his chest. For years, he had mistaken stress for purpose, busyness for value. But now he finally understood. Life doesn't need to be fast to be full. He whispered into the wind, maybe freedom isn't about escaping the world. Maybe it's about no longer being chased by it. And for the first time, that truth felt like home. One rainy afternoon, Maple Creek felt quieter than usual. The steady rhythm of rain on the rooftop filled Robert's home like a heartbeat, gentle, patient, alive. He sat by the window watching raindrops race down the glass, and for some reason, he felt an ache deep inside. Not sadness exactly, but something close to it, a longing for all the versions of himself he'd left behind. The young man who once painted on weekends, the father who used to build toy boats for his daughter, the dreamer who believed life still had chapters left to write. Somewhere between the meetings, the traffic, and the years, he had lost touch with that man. The rain didn't stop, but something inside him began to move. He went to the attic, a place he hadn't opened since he'd moved in. Dust floated in the air like soft ghosts as he pulled out an old box labeled Robert 1978. Inside were sketches, journals, and photographs, pieces of a younger soul he had almost forgotten existed. He traced his fingers over a charcoal drawing of a sunset he'd made decades ago and felt something flicker inside him, something warm, something real. That moment revealed the 10th benefit of retiring to a small town, the rediscovery of self. Here, without the constant noise of city life, he finally had the space to remember who he truly was. Maple Creek wasn't just slowing him down, it was giving him back to himself. The town's quiet rhythm, the calm mornings, the unhurried faces, they created room for reflection, for growth, for rediscovery. Later that night, he set up an easel in his living room, found an old box of paints, and began to paint again. At first, his hand trembled, but as the colors came alive on canvas, the years seemed to fade. It wasn't just a painting, it was a homecoming. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, and Robert smiled to himself. For years, he had chased success, only to find that all along what he truly needed was space to be himself again. And in that quiet little town, surrounded by rain and memory, he finally found it.
It was a cool September night when Robert realized something he hadn't thought about in years. He wasn't afraid anymore. In Chicago, even after decades, fear had become a habit. The sound of sirens at night, the double-locked doors, the nervous glance over the shoulder whenever he walked down the street, it had all become part of survival. But in Maple Creek, things were different. The nights were quiet, the doors stayed unlocked, neighbors watched out for each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That night, as he took his usual evening walk through the dimly lit streets, he saw something that made him pause. A young boy was riding his bike alone, his laughter echoing down the lane. His parents stood on the porch, talking casually, not worried in the slightest. The simple sight hit Robert harder than he expected. When was the last time he'd seen this kind of trust? This kind of safety that wasn't just about locks and alarms, but about faith in people. He stopped by the wooden bridge near the creek, listening to the sound of crickets and the gentle flow of water. And there, under the soft moonlight, he understood the 11th benefit of retiring to a small town, the peace of safety. Safety here wasn't about security systems or guards, it was about community. About knowing that if you fell, someone would catch you. If you needed help, someone would show up before you even asked. It was the kind of peace that didn't just protect your home, it protected your heart. A few days later, when a thunderstorm knocked out power across Maple Creek, the entire neighborhood came alive. People lit candles, shared meals, and checked on the elderly. Robert found himself at Martha and Bill's house, sitting by lantern light, laughing with everyone as rain poured outside. It wasn't fear he felt that night. It was warmth, belonging, safety. As the storm faded and calm returned, Robert stood at his doorway, watching the moon reappear through the thinning clouds. He smiled quietly and whispered, "In the city, I was always on guard. But here, I finally learned how it feels to let go." For the first time in a long time, Robert went to sleep, not just peacefully, but fearlessly. Autumn had arrived in Maple Creek, that golden, whispering season that made the town look like a painting. The trees glowed in shades of amber and crimson, leaves drifted down the quiet streets like slow confetti, and the air carried a soft chill that reminded Robert how precious every breath of life truly was. He sat on the same porch where his journey had begun months ago, but this time everything felt different. His heart was calmer, his smile easier, his world smaller, yet somehow richer. That morning, he received a letter from his daughter, Emily. She wrote about her fast-paced life in the city, meetings, traffic, endless noise, and asked, "Dad, don't you ever get bored there?" Robert laughed softly, folding the letter in his hands. If only she could see what boredom really looked like. The quiet joy of feeding birds by the window, the laughter at Millie's diner, the peace of walking by the lake at sunset. Later that day, Emily called, her voice tired but curious. "Maybe I should visit, see what's so special about that little town of yours." Robert's eyes softened. He replied, "You should, but be careful. Maple Creek has a way of showing you what truly matters." As he hung up, he gazed at the horizon, the town glowing under the golden light, neighbors waving from across the street, children running through fallen leaves. And he understood the 12th benefit of retiring to a small town, the legacy of contentment. It wasn't just peace of mind, it was peace of heart, a kind of wisdom that only comes when you stop chasing and start cherishing. In Maple Creek, life wasn't about what came next, it was about what was now. And in that stillness, Robert found something far more powerful than success or status: satisfaction. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Robert picked up his paintbrush one last time. On his canvas, he painted a small town bathed in gold, quiet, alive, eternal. He smiled as the last stroke completed the picture, whispering, This is what happiness looks like." And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Robert Turner realized Maple Creek hadn't just given him a new chapter, it had given him the ending every soul dreams of. The night was calm, the moonlight soft, and the town of Maple Creek seemed to breathe in unison with the stars. Robert sat on his porch, his rocking chair gently creaking, the same sound that had once filled the silence of his first lonely night there. Only now, that silence felt sacred. The shadows of the trees danced across his porch as if whispering, "You made it." He closed his eyes and remembered the city, the rush, the noise, the endless chase. It had once defined him, but here, in this small town, he found something the city could never offer: a sense of belonging without demand. That was the hidden benefit of retiring to a small town. You don't just find peace, you rediscover yourself. Every morning was slower, yet more meaningful. Every face you passed knew your name, your story, and somehow your heart. In Maple Creek, Robert learned that happiness doesn't roar, it whispers. It hides in the laughter of neighbors, in the smell of coffee from the local cafe, in the sunsets that don't ask for attention, only appreciation. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Robert picked up his paintbrush one last time. On his canvas, he painted a small town bathed in gold, quiet, alive, eternal. He smiled as the last stroke completed the picture, whispering, "If anyone out there is still searching, stop. Sometimes the greatest adventure is found in the smallest place." So if you ever find yourself wondering where peace hides, maybe it's waiting for you too, in a quiet little town under the same kind of moon.